Hey y'all, welcome back. Today I'm wrapping up all of the books that I read in February, which turned out to be a much better reading month than January was. In January I'd only read one book, but in February I managed to read 8, and I mostly enjoyed the things that I read. So the first few things that I read were for a horror manga taste test video I did kind of early in the month. I will link that in case you want to go check it out, and I'm just going to talk about these books briefly here. But the first thing I read for that was Killing Stalking Volume 1 by Kugi. This is a story about a stalker who turns out that the guy he's obsessed with is a serial killer, and he gets trapped in that guy's basement, and it's kind of Stockholm syndrome-y. It's about the relationship that develops between the two of them as this one guy is trapped. It's Yoonbum and Songwoo, I think is the other guy's name. Yeah, that's correct. So Yoonbum is trapped in Songwoo's basement, and this kind of relationship develops between them. I ultimately found this one pretty boring, given the premise. It kind of hits a pretty intense gore and violence level pretty early in the book, like within a few pages, and then it never really lets up from that, so the things that should be shocking just fail to be shocking because everything is at the same kind of intensity level, and so I think that this was ultimately weirdly boring. Also, there's not much going on besides the kind of violence between the two of them. There isn't really like an investigation element, which I thought there might be because we're introduced to some cops early on, but there isn't really anything else going on. I'm not sure if I'm going to go on and read Volume 2. I did give this one 2 stars. I felt like very neutral about it, but a little bit more towards the negative just because it was so one note. I might go back and read Volume 2 because it looks like that might have some investigation aspects to it, but for the most part I was actually pretty disappointed in this one. But we turned things around pretty quickly because the next thing I read for that was Phantom Tales of the Night by Matsuri, Volume 1, and I really enjoyed this. I gave this one 4 stars. It wasn't quite a new favorite, but I am really interested to see where the story is going to go. This is following a guy who's only known as like the innkeeper, and his kind of sidekicks, Spider and Butterfly, and he runs an inn where anybody can stay, but the cost is, rather than money, one of your darkest secrets. And so it's about the innkeeper kind of like digging out people's secrets, and it's kind of unclear whether he's like a malevolent entity of some kind, or if he's just kind of neutral, or if he's actually trying to help people at various points. So you really are never quite sure how to feel about him or his kind of cohort. I guess cohort's not the right word, his kind of minions that work with him. You never really quite know how exactly to feel about them, but it's just these like very short vignette stories of people kind of, I guess, realizing in many cases their darkest secrets or having to like give them up in some way to the innkeeper. I really liked the way this came full circle though, because the first story connects to the last story in this volume, and it starts to paint a kind of overarching narrative of somebody is trying to kill the innkeeper. We're not really sure why, but there is like this kind of larger plot of things that's happening in the background beyond the kind of individual stories, and there's a character from the first story who gets involved in that kind of bigger plot. So I am really excited to see where this is going to go. I've got Volume 2 already, and I'm hoping to read that soon. And I had a great time with this, and this was definitely like looking up from Killing Stalking since I read this next, and this trend continued into the next things that I read, which was I read Volumes 2, or not 2 and 3, 1 and 2 of Shibata Ryan, and I can't remember the author's name, but it will be on screen somewhere. But this is a manga about a guy who, like in kind of late middle school, early high school, finds a kid buried beneath a tree. He rescues him, they become friends, and it kind of goes from there. It gets very weird, especially because it seems like other people can't really see his friend Shibata, and everything becomes about Shibata. And it's just a very strange story, and I don't want to spoil anything for you because I think it's one of those that, like, it's deeply weird, and I think the experience is better if you go in knowing nothing, because there's so many like different twists and turns. But I just had a lot of fun with this. It has some interesting conversations too about like conformity and, you know, what you're willing to sacrifice to conform, or on the other hand, like what do you gain by not conforming. There's just like some interesting conversations around that. And there's also a little bit of almost an eco-criticism aspect of it that I thought was interesting. So yeah, I just had a great time with this. It's very weird. My partner recommended this to me, and I will definitely be taking more recommendations from him in the future on manga because this one was a lot of fun, and I'm actually still keeping up with it. It's currently releasing. I think I've technically read through what would be Volume 3, but it hasn't actually been released as a volume yet, so I've read Volumes 1 and 2 instead. So that was everything I read for that particular video. And then after that, I finished up The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett, which I had as an ARC. It came out in February, and this was so much fun. This is a fantasy mystery story where we're reading from the perspective of this guy who is kind of newly been assigned as the assistant investigator to the investigator for his particular region, which is Daratana. And the investigator assigned to his region is this like very strange woman. She's very eccentric. She's very blunt. I described her to my friends when I was reading it as very much like a woman version of BBC Sherlock, where she's very eccentric, she's very blunt, she just kind of like says whatever, does whatever she wants. She has a lot more leeway and kind of leverage than you think that she should have, and so you're kind of finding out these like little bits and pieces about her and like how she's gotten to this place that she's at and how she's able to kind of pull strings the way she is. But also kind of underneath all of that, there is a certain level of care that she has for other people that I think is really interesting. But we're actually reading from the perspective of her assistant. His name is escaping me right now. It's Anna and Din. That's his name, Dinios Cole. And so we're reading from Din's perspective, and he is an engraver. He's able to basically, he has an eidetic memory. He can remember everything he reads, everything he sees, everything he hears, and he works with her to investigate crimes. Except there's not much crime in Daratana until a nobleman turns up dead with a tree sprouting out of his body. And this is his Din's first murder that he has to investigate, and things kind of get out of hand, and the plot becomes much larger than this, and it's just so interesting. I think it does some really interesting stuff with power and politics that I thought was great. The world for this was so unique. All of this is happening in a world where every rainy season the world is threatened by leviathans that come out of the ocean and rampage around, and everybody's powers come from scientific advances that have come from studying the bodies of the leviathans. So there's this really interesting kind of sci-fantasy aspect to it, and I just really enjoyed this. It was a great mystery. I think it was really well plotted. I loved Din as a protagonist. I thought he was really interesting, and I liked that he had some insecurities, but also some really clear strengths. And I really enjoyed seeing the way that his relationship with Anna evolved across the book. There were also some other really great friendships that formed, and there's actually a really cute romance. I was really rooting for it. I will say, I think that the weakness of this book is that some of the relationships are pretty underdeveloped, especially the romance felt a little underdeveloped to me, but there were a lot of elements I really liked here, and just so much fun. I just had so much fun reading this. I highly recommend this, especially if you like kind of sci-fantasy, and if you like a murder mystery but you don't want something that's kind of like a typical detective story. I thought this was a really fun version of a sci-fantasy mystery. After that, I ended up reading one that I don't have on me. I put it somewhere, but I'll just put a picture up instead. It's The History of Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia by Samuel Johnson, which I read for class. I don't have a whole lot to say about this. It's kind of fun. It's kind of weird. It's a kind of Orientalist story, so be aware of that. But it's about this prince who lives in the Valley of Happiness, where he's literally trapped in the Valley of Happiness, where he's to be kept until he's supposed to assume the throne. And he and all of his siblings, all the other royalty, and they're living in this Valley of Happiness until it's their time to go rule. And he becomes really despondent and depressed and decides he wants to escape. And so he and his teacher Imlach escape, along with his sister Nikaya and her maid, whose name is Pakua. And the four of them escape and go on this adventure, and they go to Cairo, and they're just talking to different people, trying to figure out what is happiness, how do you find happiness. And it's just a very silly adventure story. It's really interesting. I had fun with it. I think I'm gonna give it 3 stars. I normally don't rate things I read for class, but this was kind of fun, so I'm gonna give it 3 stars because it wasn't anything spectacular. It's not something I'd go out of my way to read again, but I'm glad that I read it, and it was a really interesting story, and I liked the kind of exploration of happiness that was kind of the core of the story. The penultimate thing I read was also for class. This was A Map to the Door of the... I keep getting this title wrong. A Map to the Door of No Return by Dion Brand, which is a creative nonfiction book about being in the Black diaspora and the kind of lasting impact of the transatlantic slave trade. And I just think this is really interesting. This is one I'm not rating. I don't know that it needs to be rated, and I wouldn't know how to approach that anyway, because there's this really interesting blend of kind of memoir and aspects of Brand's own childhood, along with historical information and random science facts. And it's a creative nonfiction piece, so it kind of is weaving between all of these different pieces, getting bits of her childhood, but bits of her adulthood, things about cartography, things about Leonardo da Vinci randomly, and hummingbirds, and it's just this really interesting weaving together of pieces to talk about the experience of being in the diaspora. And yeah, I It's one that I'm still having trouble figuring out how to talk about it. It's really interesting. I actually pre-ordered it. It's coming out in the US in October. I'm borrowing a library copy at the moment, but I pre-ordered a copy because it's one that I want to return to and like spend some time kind of highlighting, because I didn't get to do that since I had a library copy, and there was just so much like beautiful writing in it. So I would highly recommend this if it sounds at all intriguing to you. I just don't know exactly how to describe it, but I did really enjoy my time reading it. It was a really interesting reading experience. And then the final thing that I read was actually terrible, and this one I do have. Hang on. Forgot to grab it. But the last thing I read this month was Gothicana by Runix. I did do a full spoiler vlog for this, so if you want to know all of the details, I will link that so you can go check it out. But this book is terrible. I gave it 1 star, and my briefest thoughts on it are that it's basically a story about a young woman who is vulnerable. She has no like social contacts outside of her trip to this university. Like, she has no family, she has no friends, she's vulnerable in part because she has her family has schizophrenia kind of running through it, and so she's really concerned about developing schizophrenia and kind of the rejection that she would experience as a result of that. And basically she's super vulnerable. She goes to this university called Varenmore that's like super secretive and exclusive, and basically gets preyed upon by a teacher, and the whole thing is framed as being really romantic and sweet, and that he's like so supportive of her and all these things, but he never really supports her. He just doesn't let her have privacy. He pursues her very aggressively, but then like blames it on her. So if she didn't consent to any of the stuff that he does, I'm almost certain that he would then, like, it would be very like rape culture kind of defense, that like it was all her fault, that he couldn't control himself, and it just was really disgusting in my opinion. And I think that it's also beyond that, just really poorly written. There's lots of really obvious errors that it's so clear that Tor acquired this, or Bramble I should say acquired this, and that it did exactly 0 editing on it, because there are so many like timeline errors and weirdnesses. There's just blatantly wrong words. There's one character who's, I think, a doctoral student. Actually, it's the love interest. And at various points it keeps saying he's working on his thesis or his dissertation. Those aren't interchangeable things, and yet it kept doing it. So my brain came up with fusertation, which I kind of hate. But yeah, there were just so many errors in this. It was just poorly written, poorly edited. Actually, I don't think it was edited at all. And beyond that, I think it's romanticizing abuse and not addressing that romanticization. So I cannot more highly disrecommend this book. Don't pick it up, don't waste your money, and I hated it. But if you want to hear my thoughts beyond that, like, you can go check out my spoiler vlog where I go into the full plot, full summary, so that then you don't have to waste your money if you do want to know what actually happens in the book. So that is an option. But yeah, that's everything that I read in February. Overall, pretty good month. Most of the things I read, I rated 4 stars or 3 stars. Just a couple of disappointments kind of at the beginning and end of the month, but overall pretty good, and I'm feeling really like excited to go into my March reading. I have some things lined up that I'm very excited to read, and I'm feeling like I'm kind of getting my momentum back, so I'm really excited about that. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have for you today. I really hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you have, I hope you'll consider giving a like, maybe even subscribing to see what comes next. I'm currently posting on Tuesdays and Saturdays, so there is more content coming soon, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.